You're going to miss your flight. Don't trade your future for an old man. Ethan Cole stood in the boarding line, his heart beating faster than usual. In his hand was the ticket for the most important interview of his life, something he had waited years for, paid for with skipped lunches and countless sleepless nights. Then a heavy sound came from behind him. Not a loud crash, just the sound of a body hitting the floor in silence. Near the gate, an elderly man had collapsed, silver hair disheveled, breathing fast and shallow, as if he didn't have enough air left for even a few more seconds. A few people glanced over. Someone slowed for half a step. Then everyone kept moving, because no one wanted to be the one who missed their flight. Ethan looked at the departure board. Time was slipping away second by second. He heard the whispers behind him. This wasn't his problem, airport staff would handle it. A stranger wasn't worth sacrificing a future for, but his feet had already left the line. He set his bag down, knelt beside the trembling man, and kept his voice steady as he called for help. When the final boarding announcement echoed for his flight, Ethan didn't turn around. He simply said slowly and clearly, as if reminding himself, flights can be changed. People can't. If you believe that true courage isn't found in gunfire, but in the silence of those who choose to do what's right, subscribe to Service Honor Stories, so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our heroes. The veteran didn't say a word. He simply breathed short, heavy breaths, as if every inhale were a quiet negotiation with time itself. His hand trembled slightly, yet it gripped his worn military dog tags tightly, the metal edges smoothed down by years, as if they were the only thing still keeping him upright in this moment. His eyes were open, not panicked, not pleading, only carrying the strange focus of someone long accustomed to moments where the smallest mistake could cost a life. Ethan knelt close beside him, keeping his voice steady. "Try to breathe slowly," he said, not loud, not rushed, just enough for the man to hear and hold on to. The old man didn't respond, but his breathing grew a little more even. Ethan took out his phone and called for medical assistance. Every sentence brief and clear, nothing unnecessary. An elderly man with breathing difficulties. We're near the boarding gate. Yes, he's conscious. He ended the call, set the phone down, and turned back to the man in front of him, as if nothing else existed beyond this moment. The boarding announcement sounded again flat and impersonal, reminding everyone that the flight was about to close. Ethan heard it clearly. He knew exactly what it meant for him. But he didn't turn around. He didn't glance at his watch. He didn't look at the departure board. He simply placed his hand on the floor, grounding himself, making sure the man beside him wouldn't be left alone in the current of people moving past. Someone nearby spoke up, voice low but audible. "Airport staff will take care of it." Ethan didn't argue. He answered with actions, sliding his jacket carefully under the veteran's head so he wouldn't be lying directly on the cold floor. The man shifted slightly, his grip on the dog tags tightening. His eyes moved across Ethan's face and lingered there as if trying to memorize it. Then he whispered, barely audible, "Your flight." Ethan leaned closer. "I'm here," he said simply. No promises. No explanations. The veteran's breathing was slower now, though each exhale still carried weight, so he closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them again, as if afraid that if he kept them shut too long, the young man beside him might disappear. The dog tags in his hand lightly tapped the floor, producing a small, sharp, metallic sound, undeniably real. Ethan heard it and understood that this sound carried more years than any story could ever tell. Around them, people kept walking. Some glances lingered longer. Some people turned away faster. No one said anything more. Silence spread, not the empty kind, but a silence with weight where unspoken questions began pressing down on every passing step. Ethan held his position. When an airport employee came to ask about the situation, he answered briefly and directly. "He needs medical assistance. I'm staying." There was no long explanation. No requests. Just a steady presence as if he had chosen to stand still here and nothing could move him away. The veteran opened his eyes again and looked straight at Ethan. In that moment, there was no age gap, no generational divide, only two human beings sharing a narrow space, one growing weaker, the other choosing not to leave. Neither of them needed to say anything more. Their presence was enough. The final boarding announcement sounded, then fell silent. Ethan still didn't turn around. He didn't know what he had missed, and he didn't reconsider the decision he had just made. He only knew that right now, a person's dignity was being preserved through the shared silence of two men. And in that quiet space, when no one spoke, the surrounding eyes began to change as if something were about to be revealed, even though no one had yet found the words to name it. Whispers began to spread, quiet, but loud enough to be heard. "Not our problem." A low, dry voice came from behind, sounding like a way to reassure itself. Another person followed immediately, quicker and more decisive. Someone's already taking care of him. The words weren't aimed at anyone in particular, yet they landed squarely in the space where Ethan was kneeling beside the veteran, like small stones thrown into still water. Ethan heard them. The veteran heard them too. He didn't turn his head. He didn't react. He simply tightened his grip on the dog tags in his hand, his knuckles turning white for a brief moment, before relaxing again, as if he were used to letting such words pass, without needing a response. An airport employee stepped closer, her voice carefully polite. "Sir, we've called for medical assistance. You should probably be taken to the hospital for evaluation." The veteran opened his eyes and looked directly at her. He drew in a long breath deep enough to steady his voice. "Not yet," he said slowly. Just 2 words, but they carried a certainty that made the person in front of him pause for half a beat. "I'm fine. Give me a little more time." It wasn't a plea and it wasn't defiance. It was the voice of someone accustomed to making decisions even as his body weakened. The employee hesitated, then stepped back. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. Someone shrugged as if to suggest the situation was being blown out of proportion. Someone else turned away, avoiding eye contact. See, another voice whispered, this time tinged with irritation. "He's still conscious." A different voice replied, half joking, half dismissive. "Probably just tired." Ethan lifted his gaze briefly, scanning the faces that were speaking, before looking back down at the man in front of him. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He simply said clearly enough for the airport staff to hear, "He needs to breathe in peace." The sentence was short, with no added explanation, but it was enough to draw an invisible line between them and the rest of the crowd. The atmosphere around them began to change. Footsteps slowed. The distance between the passengers and the 2 men on the floor widened slightly, as if people were unconsciously steering clear of something they couldn't name. A security officer standing at the edge of the area started paying closer attention. His gaze no longer skimmed past. It stopped and observed. Another officer, also in uniform, stepped forward a few paces and exchanged a brief look with his colleague. The veteran shifted again. He adjusted his position, leaning back against a chair, trying to keep his back straighter. Ethan supported his arm. "It's okay," he said quietly. The man nodded, almost imperceptibly, more in acknowledgement than a reply. A young passenger standing nearby blurted out, not hiding his frustration. "We have flights too." The words hung in the air, aimed at no one, yet clear enough to make the growing divide impossible to ignore. The security officer moved closer. "What's going on here?" he asked. His tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. The airport employee answered briefly. "An elderly passenger is experiencing breathing difficulties. We've called for medical assistance." The officer nodded, looked at the veteran, then at the military dog tags in his hand. His gaze lingered longer than necessary, as if he were trying to read something he didn't yet understand. The whispers began to fade, not because people understood more, but because caution had set in. Distances were kept more carefully. Eyes grew less indifferent and more watchful. The veteran said nothing further. He simply sat there, breathing more evenly, now his hands still wrapped around the dog tags, his calm demeanor strangely out of place amid the tension spreading around him. Ethan sensed it before anyone said a word. The air had changed. It was no longer the initial indifference, but not yet respect either. It was a suspended moment when society begins to realize that there are people and memories that cannot be pushed aside so easily by a few careless remarks. And it was precisely as those eyes began to examine more closely that a quiet chain reaction was set in motion, pulling forward movements none of them yet knew how to anticipate. The gate area began to thin out in a way that was hard to name. Not because anyone gave an order, but because one by one, people instinctively stepped back, as if sensing an invisible boundary that had just been drawn. Empty seats revealed the cold floor, where Ethan still sat beside the veteran. There were no more hurried footsteps cutting through, no more casual remarks drifting past. The space contracted, narrowing its focus onto the 2 men at its center, while everything else quietly withdrew. A TSA officer approached his steps, slow and steady. He lowered himself to eye level, his voice neutral. "I need to check your identification." The veteran didn't respond immediately. He took a short breath, then extended his hand. The wallet opened neatly. An ID card was placed down first. And finally, the military dog tags, thin worn the metal, darkened by time. Ethan saw the TSA officer's eyes pause longer as the engraved markings on the tags came fully into view. There was no comment, no unnecessary question. Just a brief pause, long enough for attention to gather. The TSA officer straightened, turned half away, and raised his radio close to his mouth. He spoke quietly and quickly, his voice no longer even. A short sequence of codes came through uninterrupted and unexplained. He lowered the radio and looked back at the veteran, his expression entirely different from moments before. Not pity, not curiosity. Recognition. Other personnel began to appear at the edges of the area. They didn't move closer, but stood far enough apart to form a discreet ring of observation. A nearby information board went silent mid-announcement. A flight at the adjacent gate was delayed without explanation. No one complained out loud. Those waiting understood that questions no longer belonged here. The veteran remained seated. He didn't look around. He didn't search for reactions. He simply held the dog tags in his hand, resting them on his knee, like an object long accustomed to being exactly where it belonged. Ethan felt the shift clearly before he understood it. The air was different now. Eyes no longer looked at him as a disruption, but as part of something being handled at a higher level. A TSA officer returned his voice lower. "Please wait a moment longer." That was all. No apology. No explanation. The veteran nodded very slightly. Ethan recognized the gesture not as compliance, but as the familiar assent of someone who had waited before in situations where time always carried life and death weight. The surrounding area continued to empty. Passengers were directed down alternate paths. Questions were stopped by short, polite, decisive replies. No one argued. No one tried to push through. The silence no longer felt heavy. It carried the sense of order being quietly restored step by step, detail by detail. Ethan looked down at the veteran's hand. Deep lines ran along the knuckles. A faint scar crossed the back of the hand so old it nearly blended into the skin. This was not the first time the man had waited amid uncertainty, and perhaps not the first time power had shifted without a single declaration. Another security officer appeared exchanging quick looks and gestures with a colleague. There were no raised voices, no display, just actions flowing one into the next with the precision of long habit. Nearby flights were paused one by one. Short announcements sounded, then fell silent. Everything unfolded with a smoothness that was almost unsettling. Ethan understood that what was happening wasn't about him yet. He remained where he was. No one asked him to leave. No one told him to stay. His presence had been tacitly accepted, as if his original decision had placed him here long before this moment arrived. The veteran closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them again. His breathing was steadier now. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The signs around him were speaking on his behalf. Authority was shifting not loudly, not through argument, but through the quiet acknowledgement of those who knew what they were standing in front of. And as that silence took on structure, a new movement began to form, carrying the clear signal that decision-making was about to leave the crowd and pass into the hands of those with real authority. "He's with me. I'm not leaving." Ethan said it quietly, but clearly enough to cut through the hesitation hanging in the air. He stood upright, his shoulders relaxed, his voice not defiant, just a simple affirmation of a choice already made. The security officer looked at him, then at the veteran. "Please cooperate," the officer said, keeping his tone neutral. "Both of you need to remain seated here." Ethan nodded. "We're staying," he replied. "Nothing more? No conditions?" The veteran looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's for a brief moment. "You don't have to," he began. Ethan interrupted softly. "I know," he said, "but I'm staying." The old man fell silent, then gave a slight nod. That silence wasn't surrender. It was the acceptance of someone long accustomed to having others stand beside him in the hardest moments. Security stepped back half a pace and raised a radio. "Maintain the current situation," he said. "No movement." Another voice answered on the other end, short and clipped. Ethan caught fragments insufficient to understand, but enough to know the decision no longer belonged here. The veteran placed his dog tags in the open palm of his hand and left them there, as if every necessary answer already rested within them. Another staff member approached, his voice lower. "We need you both to wait." Ethan met his gaze. "How long?" The man didn't answer immediately. "Not long," he said finally. Ethan nodded again. No further questions. No resistance. Just a steady refusal to leave his place. A quiet voice called from behind. "Sir," a passenger asked, lowering his tone. "Is this serious?" Ethan didn't turn around. The veteran answered instead, very slowly. "It's not your concern." The sentence ended there, enough to close off any curiosity. Then the shift happened without introduction. Security received further instructions. The surrounding distance widened. Someone spoke rapidly into a radio, then stopped. Ethan sensed the rhythm, unhurried, controlled, familiar, like a sequence of rehearsed reflexes. The veteran closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. His breathing steadied. "There's a convoy coming," a staff member said quietly. Ethan asked, "What kind of convoy?" The man shook his head. "I'm not authorized to say." The refusal wasn't evasive. It was procedural. Ethan understood. He turned to the veteran. "Are you okay?" The man nodded. "I'm fine," he said. "Let them do their job." A confirmation came through another radio. "They've arrived." Security exchanged looks. No one shouted orders. No one ran. Ethan saw the focus in their eyes. The veteran adjusted his posture, his back straighter, his hands neatly placed. He didn't ask what was about to happen. He knew how to wait. Then a voice appeared, deep and steady, not raised. "Where is he?" Security responded immediately. "Here, sir." Ethan turned his head. He saw a man in a crisp military uniform, chest full of ribbons, 4 silver stars clearly visible. No explanation was needed. No introduction required. His presence alone was enough. The general stopped in front of them, his gaze passing over Ethan, before settling on the veteran. "Sir," he said, slow and clear. The veteran opened his eyes and met his stare. "You're here," he replied. Just 2 short lines yet. The space around them seemed to rearrange itself into a new order. Ethan remained still. He didn't know what to say. The general turned to him. "Who are you?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I stayed with him." The general gave a slight nod. "Good," he said. No praise. No further questions. Just a recognition deep enough to make Ethan feel his chest ease. The silence now was no longer empty. It had shape. It had weight. Those around them understood that from this moment on, words were unnecessary. Order had been established by the presence of the highest authority. And precisely as that silence settled into its proper place, the greatest question began to surface. Who was the silent man that made an entire system stop and listen? The general stopped in front of the veteran and said nothing at first. He looked straight at him for a long moment, as if confirming something he had already known before arriving. Then he lowered himself and went down on one knee, the movement precise and formal, no display, no hesitation. "Sir," he said, his voice deep and clear. "I'm here." There was no lengthy introduction, no unnecessary ceremony. That single salute was enough for everyone around them to understand that the order of things had shifted. The veteran opened his eyes and looked down at the general kneeling before him. He wasn't surprised. He simply exhaled more easily, as if a weight had just been set down where it belonged. "Stand up," he said. "That's not necessary." The general rose, but the respect in his eyes never changed. "For me it is," he replied briefly. The silence that followed didn't last long, but it was deep enough for every witness to realize what they were standing in front of. The general turned to Ethan. "You stayed with him from the beginning." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." "Do you know who you were sitting beside?" Ethan shook his head, honestly. "No, sir." The general looked back at the veteran, then returned his gaze to Ethan. "This is Colonel Michael T. Briggs," he said, each word placed with care. "An intelligence officer during the Cold War. A man who commanded operations that were never named, never recorded in any history book you've ever read." Ethan heard the name, but it didn't immediately carry meaning. What stopped him was the way the general continued slower, now firmer. "Millions of people are living in peace," he said, "because he never needed to be known." The sentence landed lightly, yet its weight spread instantly. The veteran didn't object. He didn't confirm it either. He simply looked at Ethan, his gaze calm, as if this had never been a source of pride or a reason to demand recognition. "You stayed," the general continued, looking directly at Ethan, "while others walked away." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. It was just the right thing he said. The general nodded. It was he repeated. And not everyone can do that. The veteran shifted slightly, as if wanting to end the exchange that was beginning to center on him. "Enough," he said. "We don't need to say more." But the general wasn't finished. He turned to those standing nearby. "You need to understand," he said, his voice not raised, but carrying clearly what this man did will never hang on a wall. There will be no medals on display. He paused for a beat. "And that is exactly why we are standing here." No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was no longer empty. It was agreement. Ethan looked down at the dog tags in the veteran's hand. He understood why the metal had worn smooth. Not because of time, but because it had been gripped in moments when no one else was there. He understood why the man hadn't wanted to go to the hospital right away. Not out of stubbornness, but because he was accustomed to controlling his own breathing in situations far worse than this. "You missed your flight," the general said, his voice softer now. "I know." Ethan hesitated slightly. "It's fine," he replied. "There's another one." The veteran looked at him longer this time. "Not everyone thinks that way," he said. Ethan didn't answer. His throat felt dry, not from fear, but because he finally understood who he had been sitting beside. The general gave a brief signal. "Prepare transport." Then he turned back to the veteran. "Sir, we'll take you now." The veteran nodded. "All right," he said. But slowly. The general allowed himself a faint smile. "Yes, sir." Ethan stood still, unsure whether to step forward or back. The veteran turned to him. "What's your name, Ethan?" he answered. "Ethan," the veteran repeated. "Thank you for staying." That was all. No flourish, no promises. Yet for Ethan, it was the moment he knew his decision had touched something far greater than a missed flight. And once the truth had finally been spoken aloud, the question was no longer who the man was, but what we are meant to learn from the silence he carried for an entire lifetime. Colonel Briggs looked at Ethan for a long moment, long enough for the silence to feel comfortable rather than heavy. Then he spoke, his voice rough but clear. "You didn't have to stay. It wasn't a rebuke. It wasn't a test. It was simply a truth spoken by someone accustomed to seeing the cost of decisions made in an instant." Ethan stood straight, his hands relaxed at his sides. "It was just the right thing to do," he replied. No faster, no slower, as if the answer had been waiting for him for a long time. Colonel Briggs nodded slightly, his gaze softening. "It was," he said. "And that's why you stayed." The general standing beside them listened, then spoke, his voice firm, as if sealing a conclusion. "That instinct can't be trained." He looked at Ethan without scrutiny, without judgment. "Some things aren't in manuals or orders. They only appear when no one is watching." Ethan swallowed. He didn't know how to respond. He began. The general shook his head. "No explanation is needed," he said. "We understand." Colonel Briggs leaned in slightly, just enough for Ethan to hear. "In my years," he said, "the right decisions rarely come with applause." He paused and took a deep breath. "They come with silence." Ethan looked down and nodded. "I think, if I had walked away," he said, "I would have carried that with me forever." Colonel Briggs allowed a faint smile. "You chose to carry something else," he replied. "This way is lighter." The general made a brief gesture. An aide stepped forward and placed a thick envelope into Ethan's hands. "This is a letter of thanks," the general said. "From us." Ethan opened it, read quickly, then closed it. "You didn't have to," he hesitated. "There was no need." The general met his eyes. "There was," he said. "Not to repay you, but to acknowledge you." He placed a small card into Ethan's hand as well. "Federal access," he said succinctly. "It will help you in your work. Don't see it as a reward. See it as responsibility." Colonel Briggs extended his hand, palm open. A small coin rested there. "A challenge coin," he said. "Not for display." Ethan accepted it, feeling its measured weight. "What is it for, sir?" he asked. Colonel Briggs looked at him, his expression serious. "To remind you," he said, "that there are moments when you must stand still even while the world keeps moving." Ethan nodded, closing his fingers gently around the coin. "I'll remember." The general added, his voice deep but warm. "Careers may arrive early or late. Character always comes first." He looked at Ethan as if setting a quiet vow. "If you hold on to that, the right doors will open." Ethan exhaled lighter this time. "Thank you," he said. Colonel Briggs shook his head. "No," he replied. "Thank you for not needing thanks." Someone nearby spoke softly, as if confirming what had just occurred. "We've seen many people walk past." The general nodded. "And we saw you stay." Ethan lowered his head slightly, not in embarrassment, but in understanding that any further words would be unnecessary. Colonel Briggs touched the back of Ethan's hand, a brief, assured gesture from someone accustomed to granting trust. "Go on," he said. "Carry this with you." Ethan looked back at them one by one. "I will," he said. "And I won't forget." The general nodded. "That's enough." No one spoke further. Everything that needed to be said had been said. The lessons settled, needing no frame, no repetition. And when the final words faded, what remained wasn't paperwork or privilege, but the way the story would continue to live quietly in the ordinary choices that lay ahead. The story ends there, just as many important stories do. There was no evening news segment mentioning the veteran's name. No bold headlines about a terminal being shut down. No video clip that went viral. Everything closed quietly, as if it had never happened at all. Those who were there that day understood something essential. Some things do not need to be told in order to exist. They only need to be remembered in the right place. Ethan returned to his life. There were no long explanations to family or friends. He simply said that he had missed a flight. A few weeks later, an email appeared in his inbox. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a rejection. It was an invitation. The interview was rescheduled, but not at the original level. It was higher. The wording was brief. The tone was respectful. No one explained why, but Ethan understood that the moment he chose to stand still had been seen in ways he would never fully know. On his first day at the new job, Ethan didn't mention the old story. No one asked. Everything felt normal, yet in brief exchanges, he sensed a quiet trust. Not because his resume was stronger, but because something in the way he had chosen had been weighed. Character had gone first, and this time the career followed. One late afternoon, a small package arrived at Ethan's desk. No return address. No explanation enclosed. Only his name, neatly written. Inside was a carefully folded American flag, its creases straight and firm, as if shaped by hands deeply familiar with ceremony. Ethan lifted the flag and felt its weight heavy, not in fabric, but in meaning. Tucked inside was a small slip of paper, the handwriting slightly unsteady but clear. Thank you for standing still when everyone else kept walking. Ethan read the line again and again. There was no signature. None was needed. He knew who had written it. He folded the note, placed it back inside the flag, and set both in the corner of his desk. No frame, no place of honor, just somewhere he could see it every day, close enough to remind him, discreet enough to keep it from becoming a display. Life moved on, work grew busy, new decisions appeared, and whenever he faced a difficult choice, Ethan remembered the aged hand gripping worn dog tags, remembered the deep voice of a man who had lived an entire life in silence. He never told the story to anyone. He simply let it guide how he acted quietly, steadily, without needing witnesses. Not every hero is called by name, but every right action taken at the right moment leaves a mark. That mark doesn't live in headlines. It lives in the choice a person makes to stand still when the whole world is rushing past. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video, and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,